I entered the hospital to save lives, but what I found that night made me question if I was still in the world of the living. There are secrets that the walls of a hospital hide, and some are so dark that not even death can bury them. My first night shift started quietly, but something about the hospital's atmosphere unsettled me. The hallways were long and silent, with the fluorescent lights flickering from time to time, casting strange shadows on the walls. I didn't know if it was just fatigue or the natural tension of working in an old hospital, but that feeling of being watched seemed to follow me from the moment I arrived. Right at the beginning of my shift, while organizing medical charts, an elderly patient called me over. He looked distressed, his eyes wide as if he had just seen something that terrified him. "She was here," he murmured, gripping my arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Who was here?" I asked, trying to calm him down. He took a deep breath, his lips trembling as he mumbled, "The nurse. The one who doesn't belong to this world." I didn't know how to respond, so I just told him to rest. However, his words stayed with me. Although I had worked in hospitals for years, there were always stories that older staff members told about strange figures or inexplicable events. I brushed it off, as I always did with these rumors, but that night felt different. As I walked through the hallways, I noticed that some of the staff were unusually tense. A veteran nurse, while adjusting a patient's medication, looked at me and whispered, "If you hear footsteps behind you, don't look. Just keep walking." He didn't provide any more explanation and hurried off. It was impossible not to think about it. The hospital seemed to breathe on its own. There was always the sound of machines running, the distant echo of voices in the hallways. But that night, these noises seemed louder, more intense, as if they were trying to warn me about something. Later, during my rounds, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I kept walking, trying to shake off the growing dread. In one of the rooms, I found a patient awake, staring blankly at the ceiling. He told me that a woman had been there just minutes earlier, adjusting his pillows and telling him everything would be fine. When I asked who it was, he described a nurse with an immaculate white uniform and eyes that seemed dead. I pretended it was just a dream and reassured him, but I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. When I returned to the charting room, I found some old records forgotten in a drawer. Among the documents, there were reports of inexplicable deaths that occurred during the early morning hours, all on the same floor I was working. The records seemed incomplete, as though someone had tried to erase or hide them. At the end of the shift, as I was packing up to leave, I once again felt that presence. It was as if someone was standing behind me, breathing almost inaudibly. I turned around suddenly, but once again, no one was there. As I left the hospital that morning, the sky was starting to brighten, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that place. The story from the patient, the footsteps in the hallways, and the old documents hammered away in my mind. Even though I tried to rationalize it all as coincidence or imagination, I knew, deep down, that this night was just the beginning. The following day brought no relief to my unease. Although the hospital was as silent and empty as any other, there was something strange in the air. Every step I took down the hallways seemed to echo louder than usual, and the familiar smell of antiseptic felt even more penetrating. Despite the movement of patients and doctors, it felt as if something was out of place, as if the hospital was watching me in silence. As night fell, the hallways became empty once again. The night shift at the hospital was always the quietest, the darkest, but that night felt different. I was assigned to one of the older floors, a section rarely used due to its age and the fact that patients with more serious conditions were transferred to more modern areas. It was a location far from the center of activity, and so I always avoided that floor. But that night, fate led me there. As I walked down that dimly lit corridor, a soft melody, like a low song, caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just the wind, perhaps coming through an open window or a door that hadn't been properly closed. But as I got closer to the end of the hallway, The voice became clearer, as if it were truly coming from inside one of the rooms. Curious, yet apprehensive, I decided to investigate. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint light of a bedside lamp illuminating the space. The melody seemed to echo from the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, but there was no other sound in the hall. I gently pushed the door open, and what I saw left me speechless. The room was empty, except for the perfectly made bed and a rocking chair, which was gently moving as if someone had just gotten up from it. The air was cold, despite the central heating being on, and the only thing left was an almost oppressive silence. The song stopped as suddenly as it had started, and I felt uncomfortable, as if I were intruding on a place that didn't belong to me. For a moment, I thought it could just be an illusion, perhaps the light playing tricks on my tired mind. But when I looked at the bedside table, I saw something that sent chills down my spine. A water jug and a glass were positioned exactly as if someone had just stepped out to do something, leaving everything in perfect balance. It was as though the nurse had just left the room, but there was no one around. I quickly left, not looking back, and my heart was pounding, trying to process what I had just seen. What did that mean? Who had sung? The strangest part was that, when I asked the other staff later, no one seemed to know anything. No nurse remembered being in that room, and the security cameras didn't capture anything unusual. Meanwhile, the stories about the night nurse began to gain more strength. One of the patients who had been transferred to the emergency department later recounted a terrifying experience. He said he had woken up in the middle of the night and seen a woman in an immaculate white uniform, watching him in silence. According to him, the nurse didn't speak, but her eyes were empty, as if she had no soul. The story seemed more like the fantasy of a delirious man, but something in his account made me hesitate. He wasn't delirious. He was terrified, and the way he described the nurse's eyes was exactly the same as the elderly patient had mentioned. I was beginning to wonder whether these reports were just coincidences, or if there was something truly supernatural happening in the hospital. That night, during my rounds, I realized that the presence of the nurse seemed stronger. The lights flickered more frequently, and the hallways were darker, as if the hospital were trying to hide its secrets. I knew I was in something much deeper and more dangerous than I had imagined. Something that was beyond my understanding. Something the hospital was trying to keep buried at all costs. Chapter 3. The Mystery of the Inexplicable Deaths. As the shift progressed, I could no longer shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the hospital. The hallways, which once seemed only silent and cold, now felt oppressive. The sound of machines beeping and the echoes of other staff members' footsteps became unsettling, as if the building itself were alive, watching every movement. The stories of nurses who were never present, of patients seeing shadowy figures in the dark, began to intertwine with my own experiences. That night, as I began my rounds, one of the more experienced nurses approached me hurriedly with a look of panic in his eyes. "Have you heard about the deaths on the old floor?" he asked in a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard. Before I could answer, he continued, "These patients, they died under inexplicable causes, all during the night and always in one of the most distant rooms." He looked nervous, as if merely mentioning it could draw him into a darkness he didn't want to face. Intrigued, I asked for more details, but he hesitated, looking around before speaking quietly. "No one talks about it, but over the years, there have been several deaths where the patient seemed fine the day before. The nurse, she's always mentioned. They say she has a connection to these deaths, but no one has ever proven anything. Some people believe she's the cause." The nurse said no more, and before I could question him further, he quickly left, almost running down the hall. I was left alone, thinking about his words, and a growing sense of dread filled me. This wasn't just a story told by the veterans of the hospital. Something was truly happening there, something the others preferred to ignore, but that I could no longer push aside. During my rounds, I decided to investigate the medical records of those patients who had died mysteriously. I found old files in a rarely used storage room. Looking at the death dates, I noticed that they always occurred at the same time of night, typically between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. What frightened me more was that, before their deaths, the patients had appeared perfectly fine, with no signs of serious complications. No diagnosis explained the deaths, and the doctors were always baffled. Looking more closely, I realized that the rooms where the deaths occurred were located on the same floor where I had heard the strange melody the previous night. It was the same old wing, the one that few doctors or nurses dared to visit. Something in that place was connected to everything I was experiencing. I decided to investigate further. I visited the rooms where the deaths had occurred, but what I found was even more disturbing. The beds were made with exaggerated precision, as if no one had ever died there. The smell of disinfectant was overwhelming, but instead of calming me, it only heightened my sense of dread. It was as if the hospital was trying to hide something. In each of these rooms, I noticed something in common. A water jug and a glass, positioned exactly the same way. Everything was perfect, but the atmosphere was thick, heavy, and the air seemed saturated with something that couldn't be explained. As I was observing these rooms, a nurse appeared in the hallway, her familiar figure, yet strangely distant. When I saw her, my instinct was to ask if she knew anything about the deaths, about the mysterious nurse I was trying to understand. However, she looked at me for a moment and said, in a low voice, as if she were sharing a secret, "Be careful with what you seek. Some questions should not be asked." Those words froze me. It was as if she knew something, but couldn't speak of it. She quickly disappeared down the halls, and I was left alone, immersed in a whirlwind of unanswered questions. What was happening there? What did the nurse know? And why did the hospital seem to hide these secrets at all costs? As I continued my rounds, the feeling that something terrible was unfolding within those walls intensified. I knew that to uncover the truth, I would have to go deeper. But at the same time, a voice in my head warned me of the danger of moving forward. Some things, perhaps, were better left buried. The night was thicker than ever. I knew that, after everything I had seen and heard, I could not turn back. The hospital, with its cold walls and endless corridors, was becoming a maze of unfathomable mysteries. The inexplicable deaths, the ghostly nurse, and the stories circulating throughout the place were finally converging into something I could no longer ignore. Something was lurking in those shadows, something that, somehow, was waiting for me. I decided that, tonight, I would find the answers. If there was any truth buried within this hospital, I had to face it. The nurse, the one who was never seen by anyone, the one who seemed so distant, was now more present than ever. Her footsteps echoed in my mind like a sinister symphony, and I could no longer escape the feeling that she was watching me, leading me towards something greater and more terrifying than any scientific explanation I could uncover. I followed my instincts, walking down the nearly deserted hallways, once again heading toward the old floor where the deaths had occurred. The place was submerged in a thick darkness, with the weak lights flickering intermittently, as if they were about to give in to the invisible pressure of something oppressive. When I reached the entrance of the sector, a chill ran down my spine. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. With a lump in my throat, I entered. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic scent, as if blood had soaked into the walls. The silence was absolute, and even my own footsteps seemed muffled. I walked down the hallway to the back, where everything seemed to begin. The rooms were closed, but the shadows at the end seemed to move, as if something, or someone, was waiting. It was then that I saw something that made me freeze in place. At the end of the hallway, in a dark room, a figure stood out. A woman, dressed in the immaculate white uniform of a nurse, was standing, facing the window. Her hair was tied in a simple bun, but something in her eyes seemed empty, distant, as if she were no longer there, but in another place, lost in a dimension beyond my comprehension. I called out to her, my voice trembling, but she did not move. Her eyes did not turn toward me, but I could feel her gaze fixed on me, as if she were watching me without me being able to see. Time seemed to stop. I could no longer discern where she began and where the darkness ended. My mind was on the brink of despair when, suddenly, her voice was heard, faintly, like a distant echo. "You should never have come here." Those words, whispered in the silence of the night, cut through the air like a sharp blade. The fear, once controlled, now overtook me with all its might. The nurse slowly turned to face me, and I could see in her eyes something that was not human. There was an absolute absence of life, a darkness that seemed to consume everything around her. I tried to retreat, but my legs were paralyzed, as if an invisible force was holding me in place. She took a step toward me, and a wave of icy coldness swept through the room. I could no longer breathe, as if the air had been sucked away from me. And then, without warning, she moved too quickly for me to react. The nurse appeared before me, her eyes locked on mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of despair. I knew I was facing something that should not exist, something that had been there for much longer than I could understand. "You cannot leave," she said, her voice soft, yet filled with a dark power. And at that moment, I realized that the hospital was not just a building of walls and hallways. It was a place where the living and the dead coexisted, where shadows took form and death was never final. I didn't know how, but I finally managed to break free from that nightmare. I ran out of the room, the sound of my own footsteps following me like a drumbeat in the oppressive silence. When I finally reached the hospital exit, I was able to breathe again, but I knew that what had happened there could not be explained. The nurse of the night would continue her vigil, somewhere in the shadows of the hospital, and I, now, carried with me a secret I could never share. Something everyone would prefer to forget, but that would never leave my mind. Something that had rooted itself in the hospital and perhaps would never be completely buried.